So I was on another planet, Xenon, and I walked into the bar and sat across from me sat this wonderful seven-legged creature. And when she looked up and said, "Do you come to the dark side of the moon often?" I said, "Are we on the moon?" What is this music we're listening to, Mike? Welcome back, everybody. Good morning. It's Law and Legitimacy, I think.
Yeah.
So I have a consumer product alert. Avoid Airbnb. Let me tell you a little Airbnb story. Regular listeners will recall that I was trapped in Washington, in the swamp, in the deep states, circling the drain of our national psyche during the Proud Boys trial, staying in an Airbnb. I started out with what I thought would be a 6-week stay. It ended up as almost 5 months. I extended, and I noticed the weekly rate went up more as I extended. Okay, she's got a captive audience. I thought spring is here and now summer, blah, blah, blah. They ended up making a lot of money off of me. So I leave, and now suddenly I'm told that there's going to be a cleanup fee, and there's going to be, I didn't leave the key in the box. I told her when I left, "Where do you want the key?" She says, "On the counter." So I left it on the counter. Well, I didn't leave the door unlocked. So there's going to be a charge for this. There's going to be a charge for that. And I said, "That's not right." So I offered to pay a little bit of something. And so she filed a complaint with me about me with Airbnb. They asked for my side. She changed her story. Now, it was a lockout fee. It was this, it was that. I said, "I'm not paying that. I'll pay her half of that." She agreed, sent me a private note, said, "Send me the money," but she didn't tell Airbnb. So Airbnb pursued the appeal. Then they agreed to give her almost everything she wanted. And I'm like, what about the inconsistencies in her statements? What about the fact that this, that, and everything? They didn't want to hear about it. And then they opened multiple files. Now I'm getting phone calls from people and communications from people named Raul who sound like they grew up behind a donkey in India. And I'm starting to feel like I'm trapped in this world that I can't get out of. So I just gave up. Take the money out of my account, but I am not going back to Airbnb. I don't know what the hell's going on there. The appellate process is a joke. Their idea of customer service is one step short of incompetent harassment, and their ability to take any bullshit that one of their renters gives them as a basis for trying to drain more money out of somebody who just pumped 5 months worth of rent into their account is ridiculous.
Well, so here's my perspective.
Don't Airbnb, don't go.
Yeah, look, there's an entire community known as Say No to Verbo, or VRBO. VRBO acquired HomeAway, so that's for larger homes in other destinations. Usually more valuable properties than what Airbnb will cater to. Airbnb really is just sort of like a virtual hostel rental thing, right?
But no, it's a hostile rental thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But what I was thinking when I was reading your tweets and then just hearing you now, I would not bet against the fact that Airbnb is getting it from both of you. I guarantee you they are using your words that you're using against each other as a hedge to deprive both of you of additional money. That's guarantee you that's the game that they're playing.
Well,
the big problem I have with VRBO and those sorts of rental services is that, they put themselves in the position of the property owner and really deprive people of property rights. And they have a very, very restrictive user agreement whereby if you are listed with them, that you're not allowed to list your property in other places. Right. That you're not allowed to communicate with, potential renters and stuff like that. So, this is something that we can peel back in future episodes. Hopefully we can string something together along this, because real property rights is something we'll be talking about later. But Airbnb and VRBO are a stain. They are a virus, a leech.
They're another algorithmic overreach by people making a buck by not being accountable in human terms.
Absolutely.
Well, so while we're on our self-righteous toot poking holes at institutions and saying what's wrong with this world we all inhabit together, there's an awful story in Bloomberg News. I mean, I don't know who edits these pieces. I assume someone does. But there's a piece initially appeared June 20th, updated June 21 at 7:52 a.m., written by Greg Storr, Zoe Tillman, Jennifer Dlouhy, and Jordan Fabian.
And it presents like a group project. You know what I mean?
And an aggressive Supreme Court reshapes the U.S. as its standing erodes. The U.S., the Supreme Court, in the midst of a run of decisions that have stress tested the core principles of U.S. democracy, has rarely been so aggressive in using its power or been viewed with more skepticism by Americans. Seriously, is there a half a law degree among the four of them? What they're concerned with, apparently, are rulings that have curtailed environmental protections. In other words, rolling back administrative discretion in the name of statutes that have meaning to ordinary people so that we know what we do. Or put another way, curtailing a republic of virtue that places in the hands of unelected officials the right to decide what we can and can't do. Wait a minute, folks. That sounds like maybe a commitment to limited government. Oh, wait, does that? Oh, yeah, enumerated powers. Oh, yeah, the United States Constitution. Oh, yeah, somebody has to decide what the Constitution is. This isn't a coup, people. This is a move by the Supreme Court, perhaps a move in a conservative direction against an overbroad set of regulatory, against an overbroad regulatory regime that permits administrators to decide what the Supreme Court and the Constitution arguably says ordinary people should decide. And then, of course, it restricts efforts to regulate firearms. There is that potent little obstacle in the way of that called the Second Amendment. And maybe the Bill of Rights was meant to serve as a limit on democratic participation. Maybe the difference between a republic and a democracy is that in a democracy, whatever the majority wants on Monday, it can have on Tuesday. In a republic, certain things are placed beyond the reach of democratic rule and guaranteed to all individuals, thus, again, serving the function of limited government. And then limited public health initiatives. That's a coded way of referring to Dobbs versus Women's Health last year. But let me read this.
Well, before you go on, Norm, there's you did a monologue on one of the early Law and Legitimacy episodes, and I think it may have been one that you turned into audio from a blog that you wrote a while back, but you did analyze the history of certain presidential administrations and their efforts to expand the Supreme Court, and this was something that the Biden administration was criticized for early on, if we can remember for a moment, about the Supreme Court or the court packing as a term sort of in our public consciousness for a while. And so the context for this story and from Bloomberg and these four people that together still don't make a fully functioning brain is really about the fact that the Supreme Court composition right now is a 6-3 conservative majority. That is the front and back of this issue. And I wanted to put that out there because, Norm, you've done a beautiful job of laying the foundation for historically how the Supreme Court originated, how many justices there were, when it was expanded, subsequent issues to attempt to expand it, what has happened through those movements. I think FDR and the civilian concentration corps and, public works projects, certain things like that. So anyway, if any of you listening, watching are interested in getting a full background on that, I'll see if I can't post to our Twitter timeline that episode. It's really good for this. And I think will add a robustness to what you're about to say.
Yeah, and that was provoked after I tutored a young man through his con law course and had to reread all the con law cases 3-4 years ago, and I saw it, and it crystal clear. The history of Supreme Court and the history of the evolution of con law is really four symphonic movements, and we're now reacting against a concentration of power and an elimination of an attempt to eliminate federalism in the name of federal power, and an attempt to eliminate the fractured nature of power by deference to the administrative state. And this court is trying to peel that back. It's trying to, and that creates a moment in constitutional history that has discernible contours. But let me read a couple lines from a paragraph in the Bloomberg story, and let's try to deconstruct this, because I think that the business of deconstructing a text, that is probing its meaning, asking what the authors are really trying to do, and reframing it, is a useful enterprise in trying to take back control over your own life. Concerns about partisanship and ethics have taken a toll on the court's public standing, which opinion polls show is at or near record lows. Some of the court's signature decisions are in tension with the views of a majority of Americans. A year after the court struck down constitutional abortion rights, 62% of respondents in a Pew poll say the procedure should be legal in all or most cases. Well, now here, let's deconstruct that. The Supreme Court didn't eliminate abortion rights. The Supreme Court simply said there is no federal right to an abortion. The states are free to decide how to regulate abortion. This is a traditional police power. So if 62% of Americans want abortion rights, guess what? You can have
you have the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, and just and so this is not an assault on women. It's not an assault on reproductive rights. And to suggest that it is to misread what the Constitution does. The Constitution allocates powers and recognizes limitations on powers. Then next sentence, after the court last year limited the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gases emissions, a majority of Americans say they see climate change as a threat to the country and want the government to do more. What the court's done is said that administrative agencies don't have the ability to decide for us what the rules are that we will live under, that they have delegated authority from Congress, and that when Congress delegates a task, we are to have deference to some limit, to some degree, to the administrative agency's performance of the task. But Congress doesn't sacrifice its oversight role, and the Bill of Rights doesn't evaporate because an administrator says that there's a problem. Similarly, with respect to the Second Amendment issues, the court took a reading of the Second Amendment that is steeped in a view that individuals possess the right to bear arms, and many people want gun control legislation so that they'll feel safe or feel safer. I think those people neglect to account for the fact that it's not people lawfully purchasing guns and registering to purchase them that are shooting one another up and killing one another. It's usually a mentally ill person or a person who doesn't have the right to possess a gun in the first instance, and that many people want to have guns to protect themselves and to serve as a warning to government. Don't get too big for your britches. Don't take your republic of virtue too seriously, because your power ends at my doorstep. And isn't that the way it's supposed to be? There is something unique about the American experience. There is something unique about the notion of limited government. There is something unique about federalism. The American political system and its laws are designed to create and promote inefficiency because we fear a government that can get it right too often, because when it gets it right, the it isn't necessarily reality itself, it's someone's vision of reality. And we as individuals want significance in our own community, the ability to decide for ourselves how to live, and we don't want government telling us what to do. And so this whole business about Joe Rogan and the debate between Robert Kennedy and Dr. whatever his name is a perfect case in point. The doctor, I guess the ante to
Mr. Hotez.
No, it's Dr. Hotez, Dr. MD, PhD Hotez. He doesn't want to appear on Rogan to debate with Kennedy because he doesn't want to legitimize. He doesn't want to legitimize
on Rogan again, because he's already appeared on Rogan. Just for anybody watching that didn't know that, he's appeared on Rogan before, and he got eviscerated on Rogan for how unhealthy he is as a person generally. One thing you have to know when you step into Joe Rogan's sphere is that overall health and well-being is his calling card, right? And so if you are a doctor who is talking about preserving health and measures and ways to mitigate against certain environmental hazards, you must first be able to prove to Joe that you have a fundamental appreciation for your own personal health and well-being. And if you are so unable, then you're going to get chastised. And that's why.
Okay, I get that. So Dr. Blimp waddled in and he jiggled when he shouldn't have. And Joe called him out on it and said, "You're going to tell me about public health? You look like a cheeseburger on stilts."
Oh, he still corrects me. He's been on there twice. I've been corrected. Thank you, BTL.
Well, in any case, the notion that, I accept the expertise of scientists, and I accept the fact that there is an external world that can be known and that there are better techniques for knowing it than not, and that collectively we are all much better off. Our sense of utility is better off when we conform to the requirements of reality. What I'm suspicious of is a republic of virtue, a republic wherein people who claim to know and have the credentials to make that claim are going to tell us what to do with or without our consent. So in the context of the vaccine debate, Robert Kennedy may be a crank. I don't know. I've just begun to pay attention to him, but he's a public official and he legislates in the interest of the public good. And it seems to me that the doctor looks like a fool for refusing to engage him. And what he's trying to do is claim a paternalistic high ground. I am the doctor. I know better. Do what I say. And when that attitude infuses federal government, you end up with a deep regulatory state and an unaccountable set of regulatory agencies. And the Supreme Court, I think, is right to react against it. Socially, when you get Bloomberg editors and the woke out there saying, "Ooh, we know what the consensus is among the emerging correct people," you get asinine articles like this aggressive Supreme Court reshapes U.S. as its standing erodes. I mean,
we're not so far from Justice Sotomayor in oral arguments on one of the cases before the court during COVID, saying that something like over 100,000 children were on ventilators. This is one of the justices on the Supreme Court right now. So this isn't, we're not even living in a world where even the justices can be trusted to know the facts as they exist out in the media. So it's just, talking about, Dr. Hotez is one thing, but we've got a real issue here if we're talking about a limited government, right? And then in being able to even trust that the justices in their own time are consuming information or internalizing things that are the truth that are going to come to bear in oral argument on any of these core issues of sovereignty.
Well, that's a fair point. And, the courts traditionally have taken a limited role in fact-finding on the theory that they don't have the resources to do it. It's a small institution with a limited staff. Legislation should be enacted by Congress that has the ability to engage in fact-finding and so forth. Now, the problem with that is, on the continuum, Congress then said, yeah, that's right. The world's so complicated. We don't have the ability to do it that well. We need to send it off to administrative agencies, and we should defer to their interpretation of our language because they know best. Everything in the United States Constitution is a balance struck between competing and contending values. And I think what the left is missing right now is the notion that the populist revolt, as it were, the populist reaction to events in the world right now isn't a rejection of science. It isn't a rejection of reality. It's a rejection of the moral authority of those who claim to know better and who seek, by matter of public law, to impose their vision of the good on us. Now, next week, sometime either late this week or next week, there's going to be another huge crisis in the country, and it's going to result from the United States Supreme Court's announcement of its decision in two affirmative action cases, one involving the University of North Carolina, the other involving Harvard. And the question presented in both cases is whether race can be used as a criteria in distributing limited goods. It is expected, this case, admission to colleges. The court is expected to overturn affirmative action. It's been tilting in that direction for several decades. And I predict there'll be a 5-4 decision overturning affirmative action. Roberts, who you would think would join the group, is so concerned with institutional legitimacy. I think the court is still licking its wounds over the Dobbs decision. And I remind everybody that 1 year later, we still don't know who the leaker was, which I find incredulous. That's almost on par with it's almost on par, in my view, with the following. Joe Biden's son, tax problems, didn't submit tax returns. Well, he's made good. He's paid his $1.5 million in back taxes and the penalties and interest. He's paid his $2 million. Nobody's asking how this ne'er-do-well without a job got himself in a position where he owed $1.5 million in taxes for 2 years. How did Hunter's kid make that money? I suspect the answer is one that nobody really wants to answer. But with respect to the affirmative action decisions next week,
I think
take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. I need to take a deep breath. The court doesn't want to know the answer to who leaked Dobbs. It's not hard to figure out. The Congress and the Justice Department apparently doesn't want to know how Hunter made his money. Ask him. He's going to enter a plea next week in a Maryland federal court. Part of the inquiry at sentencing in terms of relevant offense conduct must be, how did Hunter make that money? And if he made it by corrupt means, he really ought not to be walking away from his tax evasion. The rest of us wouldn't be. He shouldn't either. But keep an eye on the next week's affirmative action decisions, because I think the court will 5-4 overturn it, and that will be the crisis of the summer. That will be what yields liberal angst.
With T-Girl reminds us that the student forgiveness case is set to be released next week as well. The decision in that.
And how I mean, the question presented there is who decides what the law is and who decides how to enforce the law. If we enter into contractual expectations with people under a program that Congress decides is the law of the land, does the president get to say, "Oh, never mind"? Didn't he take an oath to faithfully execute the laws? And isn't it Congress's role to make the laws? So I can see decisions that will outrage the left, but will reassure those who believe in a government of limited powers. If the court says the president doesn't have the power to walk away from an obligation that Congress imposes, that makes sense to me. If the court says that under the principles of equality before the law, we can't dole out or we can't use as a distinguishing characteristic the color of a person's skin in passing out public and private benefits, that makes sense to me. But in either case, we'll get more hand-wringing from Bloomberg. Oh, look at the aggressive Supreme Court reshaping the U.S. Maybe what the aggressive Supreme Court is saying, the United States has been reshaped. We'd like to redirect it back into a course most people are inclined to view as right. This triumph. Mike, I know there's another topic we want to talk about. Can I have permission to just
go ahead?
So, I want to alert you. Spoiler alert, get your pencil out. I want all of you to write down the following. The 1844 philosophic manuscripts by Karl Marx. These are little red papers, and they are a discussion of the making up of consciousness, of how we come to understand our place in the world. Marx was writing in the early 19th century in reaction in part to Hegel, an idealist philosopher who basically said the world reflects our ideals and what we become, and as our ideas blossom and we iron out the contradictions within them, we remake the world in terms of our ideals. That's a really rotten reading of Hegel. He's a very complicated author. Marx was a materialist, and he said, no, what makes our sense of the world isn't our ideas, but our position in the world. And our consciousness is a reflection of our interests and our location in society. And if we remake society, we can remake our consciousness. We've all become Marxists now, whether we know it or not. And so much of the social justice movement, so much of the identitarian politics movement, so much of the demand in expressive individualism that we be permitted to become who we idiosyncratically are is an application of principles that Marx developed in 1844. False consciousness is not being who you are in the world. Understanding the world is key to understanding yourself. And if you understand the world, you can change the world and make a better self. This is what our Supreme Court, I think, is reacting against, is this triumph of cultural Marxism on left and right. And it's taking us back to a world of limited government where individuals were sovereign and were assumed to have certain natural rights independent of their material circumstances. And it's inviting us to reconsider old ideas in the context of a crisis-ridden present. So don't despair.
Well, look, I just think I want to point out, you're talking about on the left and right, and I'm keen to point out certain irony when I'm able to discern. And on the one hand, we have these issues of voting, right? That's been another key topic on the politically left-oriented side of things. Talking about, access to voting, and we had all of the mail-in voting and this, that, and the third, and then the reaction against Republicans in blue states trying to pass laws to shore up certain election irregularities or what they perceive to be voids in the ability for constituents to feel secure and confident in the integrity of the elections. There were this stern pushback that, voting ID can't do that, right? None of that. Right. Everybody has to have equal access, and there's nothing that can get in the way of that. Everybody should have the unmitigated right to vote, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, when it comes to matters such as, Dr. Hotez's, sort of subject matter expertise as it were, all of a sudden everybody is too stupid to have an opinion.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. That's a great irony.
We're all too dumb. We're more than capable of voting for whatever, and nobody should get in the way of that. Except shut up when you don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, you don't know what you're talking about.
And therefore accept the alternatives that the system or the process gives you between A and B. But it may be that, both are deck chairs on the Titanic, and you'd prefer to chart your own course and not go down with that larger ship. Hey, so I don't know where we got. We, as always, ran a lot longer on the first thing than we do on the others. What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about Titanic, or you want to talk about South Dakota?
I want to save the South Dakota stuff now, since we only have about 5 minutes left here. So we'll save that for tomorrow. But just to put everybody, maybe that we can tease that to say that there is a thread. I'll put this on the screen here.
A huge eminent domain issue going on in South Dakota right now.
This made its way into my timeline yesterday, and a lot of the background you see here. Greg Price is reporting from South Dakota, Brown County. A gentleman named Jared Bosley has a farm there, upon which Summit Carbon Solutions is, what you see in the picture is what they consider to be surveying the property. Except what you don't see are the armed guards and the local law enforcement out there enforcing what they think is some right to eminent domain over what is going to be a 5-state pipeline for carbon recapture, the largest carbon recapture project in the world. So I want to take some time tomorrow and unpack a lot of that, and then also discuss what we have here on the screen is, ultimately what the hell is carbon capture and storage, and to what end are we willing, or I guess these corporations willing to infringe upon the private property rights of individuals, and what, if anything, is Kristi Noem good for, other than posing in a, with a wrench and a mechanic's gear to tell people that, become a plumber in South Dakota, if she's not actually going to stand up for anything. And what I've come to understand is that Summit Carbon Solutions was a major premier donor for her election campaign, which also makes this a little bit of a tense topic for her, along with her inability to do anything about the NCAA running roughshod over student athletes in South Dakota.
We'll also talk about what eminent domain is and what real property rights are. And it's again another illustration of individual rights versus the collective good, and how do we decide these issues. So the Titan is apparently lost. I was stunned yesterday. I thought Mike was pulling my leg. He sends me a text or a message, that the owners of the thing didn't want some 50-year-old white male operating it, CEO, because that we're boring, we old white guys. They wanted somebody a little more captivating. I don't know if they had
inspirational, right?
I don't know if they had a diversity captain, but what they did is they had the person operating this vessel with a Game Boy charger or a controller,
like a PlayStation controller. Yeah, like a $40 controller.
I don't know. To me, what is so amazing about the Titan story is we've got this small concentrated bit of metal that's going 2.5 miles deep into the ocean, and the pressures down there are so great. This vessel is designed to withstand like the Empire State Building sitting on it.
Wild.
And so it's got to be heavy. It's got to have a very dense mass. It sinks, and as we search for it, the area that is being searched is twice the size of the state of Connecticut, and the resources just can't be mobilized quickly enough to find it. What happened down there and why? Now, yesterday we talked briefly about assumption of the risk. If you know that something's risky and you do it, you are assumed to have undertaken that risk. That's a common law doctrine. Not every state recognizes assumption of the risk as a defense. Those states that do, however, recognize an exception to assumption of the risk. And that is if the person into whose hands you are placing your safety behaves in a reckless manner or somehow is in blatant disregard of your safety, you didn't assume the risk. Did the people who paid...
Basically what you're saying, Norm, is, assumption of the risk is most typically asserted as a defense in an action in negligence, right? So someone injured, they say that whoever injured them was negligent in causing the injury. And then the person who has been sued will say, well, you assume the risk. We know as a basic principle that one may not contract away his or her own negligence, right? But there are some states that say even if you are said to have assumed that risk, that that there are some circumstances under which that still will not bar a claimant's recovery. And this is sort of the basis for what we're talking about now.
Well, let me tell you something. If one of my loved ones spent $250,000 to go on this trip, and I learned that they didn't want some older guy who with experience managing himself under stress because he wasn't inspirational or exciting enough to be on the trip. And they gave the controller to somebody, a Game Boy controller, to some kid, saying, just press green and we'll go down. I think I'd be spitting nails and I'd be on my way to a courthouse and saying, assumption of risk, my you know what. And it seems to me that there are some pretty powerful questions about what's going on or what went on in the Titan company. And I gather we're going to get some answers and fairly soon, but they're likely to be sad answers. My understanding is the capsule will run out of oxygen today. And so we've got the skipper, as it were, and 4 people somewhere, presumably at the bottom of the ocean, or perhaps swept away and still moving in some current significant enough to whisk this thing from one side of the earth to the other. And I think to myself, what a world. I mean, right outside our door in the ocean, those of us who lived on the eastern seaboard, is a vast subterranean world that we scarcely understand, powerful enough to take 5 people in this capsule and move them to a location that we can't find. It's an amazing story. I'm looking forward to learning more about it in the days and weeks to come.
Yeah, and I think the juxtaposition of these two events, also the nature of the article we have on the screen there, is I think NBC making an observation as to how many resources have been deployed, how widely circulated this news is regarding the Titanic submersible, the background of the company that was chartering these things, the people that are on board who have paid the $250,000 each to be there, versus what continues to represent what I think Norm and I believe here at Law and Legitimacy is a representation of Western moral exhaustion in the face of the surging migrant crises all over the world, right? So here we have the shipwreck in the Mediterranean, hundreds of migrants from Libya, from Pakistan, Egypt, Syria, claim to have perished in that capsize. We also have reports that the Greek Coast Guard had much to do with the with the wrecking of that boat, and that facts, as reported, are now being contradicted by those survivors who are being interviewed. And then we have this issue of an American private industry, sort of a cottage industry, PlayStation remote driven capsule pushed down to a shipwreck that occurred in 1912 and wasn't itself discovered until 1985. But we have for the last 40 years as a culture just been enamored with the Titanic. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition, I think.
It sure is. I mean, we got $1 million in fees sucked up into going on this trip to nowhere, this death trip. And then we've got a boat of hundreds of people who could have taken that $1 million and presumably put it to some better use. What a world. What a world. What a world. Well, I'm not even sure what to make of it some days. Most days.
It's almost like I don't even really arrive at a conclusion except for to say, like, what a juxtaposition, right?
No kidding.
A juxtaposition on both sides. We are back tomorrow morning. We're going to just go ahead and commit to talking about the South Dakota and Summit pipeline stuff. I think that's going to be really important. I think I told Norm this morning that I expect that to become a pretty pressing story in the next weeks and months. Again, some of the background there is that there have been at least 80 eminent domain actions initiated by this company, at least 10 or 11 in South Dakota alone. It's a 5-state project, and they are looking to secure easements from all of these contiguous landowners. We'll get more into that and the nature of what, like Norm said, eminent domain, ultimately the sanctity of private property rights, and what these farmers are likely to do in response. And I hope that we can at least be something to bubble up the visibility of this stuff so that these farmers in that area can secure adequate, competent counsel and organize together to fight back on fair ground.
For those of you thinking, wait a minute, eminent domain permits the government to seize power. How can a corporation do it? There's a statute in South Dakota that gives public utilities the right to engage in eminent domain. And so this might be yet another example of we getting the government we deserve. What were you thinking when you passed that law? You didn't think some guy with profit on his mind was going to come in and try to take a piece of your property on the cheap? Maybe it's time to repeal that law. Maybe it's time to take a closer look at state constitutions and what rights are reserved to the people in state constitutions themselves. Lots to talk about, and I think Mike's right. The South Dakota story might carry a message in it for all of us about how safe and secure we are in our properties, our homes, and in our very persons.
Absolutely. Norm, we'll see you tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. For those of you that joined us today, thank you very much. We do not take you for granted. Please leave a thumbs up, like this video, comment on it later, share it with a loved one or a friend. And if you don't love your friends, I don't know you. Anyway, also, if you don't catch us live, you know where you can find us: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. Leave us 5 stars or leave us alone. Norm, I will see you tomorrow morning. Go get them in DC.
I will. Ciao. Bye, everyone.